Welcome everyone. My name is James McGibbon, and as many of you know, I'm a PhD student here at the Centre for Social Research and Health, and I'm chairing today's session with Deborah Lupton, who will be speaking about story completion methods in health research. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the Bejagal people, who are traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are here today. Now, as most of you know, this is a non-projecting microphone which is used to record the audio here. So when we open up for questions, we ask that you use this awkward microphone. And so I'd now like to welcome Deborah Lupton. Deborah is a new Sharp professor here with the Centre for Social Research and Health and Social Policy Research Centre, and is the author of 16 books, including Digital Sociology, The Quantified Self, Digital Health, and FAT. Her forthcoming book, Data Selves, will be published later this year. Deborah is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and holds an honorary doctorate awarded by University of Copenhagen. So please join me in welcoming Deborah.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me up the back okay? Fabulous, the technology is working. So speaking of technology, I'm going to go kind of unplugged in that I'm not going to have a PowerPoint presentation today, but I did want to show the website of my new Vitalities Lab, because I just thought this would be a good opportunity to let people know about it who haven't heard about it yet before I launch into the actual topic of the talk today. So as you can see, I'll just scroll up a little bit. The Vitalities Lab is actually kind of an intersection between the Social Policy Research Centre and the Centre for Social Research and Health, and I'm sort of working between the two of them. And I see the lab as being kind of, you know, that intersection of the Venn diagram, like this, where I and my team will live. So I've been very fortunate in having some Sharp funding for postdoc positions as part of my appointment, two appointments for the lab, and I have another postdoc I'll be appointing with a new discovery project that I had funded this year on Australians' understandings and practices related to personal data. So that's 3 people already, which is fantastic, and obviously I hope to grow that team and bring in ever more in increasing and large sums of money, because like we all have to around here. But anyway, and I chose the term vitalities because the word vitalities for me covers a lot of ground in terms of what I'm interested in doing, what I have been interested in doing for quite a while now. So the notion of vitalities as liveliness, as generating excitement and interest and passion about research, which I think is vital for all of us to, working in the neoliberal university today, to have something that we can really get our teeth into and enjoy doing and not doing it just for the metrics. But also the theoretical positions that I'm working from at the moment. So drawing on vital materialism, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that is in my actual talk, so I won't explain it now. So the notion also of vital methods or lively methods, and the term lively methods has been used in sociological research for a while now to talk about just new ways of doing social research that again can really get in at the way that people understand and experience everyday life. And that's really what I want to do in the lab as well. So I've got these initial research streams that I've identified, which do draw on recent research interests, and I do want to sort of build on those and expand them, but there will be other directions that we'll be going in depending on what the postdocs are interested in pursuing as well. So there's critical digital health studies, living digital data, which I interpret as people living with their data, living through their data, but also the notion of personal data as lively themselves, as circulating in the digital data economy. So that notion of data as lively, but also as the liveliness of the way that we interact with our data, and the fact that it's always a dynamic experience because data are being generated about and for us all the time. Digital food cultures, so that's something I've been interested in for a while now too, drawing on the sociology of food that I've been writing about since the 90s. So now that everything is digitised, you can sort of take any topic and say digital. But I'm actually editing a book on digital food cultures, which has some really interesting content in it, and that will be out with Routledge early next year. We're just sort of going through the final versions of the chapters now. And innovative social research methods, which gets back to that idea of lively methods. So I'm really interested in new ways of doing things, new ways of exploring social determinants of health and illness, and social ways of living in the world that involve our data, the digital technologies that we live with and alongside with and through as well. And so I will be running a few little workshops, experimenting with some different methods as we go along this year and into the future. So keep an eye out for that. And so that kind of brings it on nicely to what I want to do today, which is, so as I said, I've got no slides. So I've got this sort of printed out paper thing, and I'm going to be sort of talking to the paper. There might be times when I read out a little bit of it because it gets a little bit dense theoretically, but I won't be reading the whole thing. It's very much a work in progress, and I'm talking about today because I thought it would be good to just sort of talk about something that I've got my head in right this moment, as opposed to something that's been finished or something that's been published that people might have already seen. Now, so the story completion method. So I do know that Ginny Brown was here last year, and she talked a bit about the story completion method, right? So who saw Ginny Brown's talk on story completion method? Okay, so a few people here, but not most people. So I will just give a little bit of an overview of it, just so that everyone knows what it's about. I'm using the same method that Ginny talked about, and that she is working with quite actively with herself and colleagues and other people working in that space of mostly social psychology, but I'm coming at it from a very different theoretical and analytical perspective. So I'll be explaining quite some detail about that theory, because I think that's really important, because I would argue that when we engage in research methods, we are always thinking with theory. It's not a matter of taking the method and then theorising the method. It's the other way around as far as I'm concerned. You're thinking about theories that you're working with at that time, and what method will help you sort of extend those theories, build on the theories, and do new things with those theories. So narrative. So the importance of narrative has been acknowledged for a long time now in social research and in the medical humanities. And people have used eliciting narrative about health, illness and healthcare and recovery for a long time now as a way of giving a voice to people's lived experience. And of course, storytelling is a very powerful way of people talking about their experiences. It really lends a richness and a vividness when it's represented in a story form. So that's been understood and worked with for a long time in social research and medical humanities. But there's also another way of using stories, which is as a research tool as well. So eliciting stories from people when you're doing interviews with them or focus groups or other forms of social research, getting that sort of narrative from them and then using those narratives as your research materials. So the story completion method fits into that general interest in narrative and how people talk about their health and illness experiences. And it comes out, it's interesting that when you look at the discussions of where story completion comes from, it comes out of very much a counselling and therapeutic context. So it began as a psychoanalytic therapeutic response to getting people to complete a story that's given to them. They're given the story stub, which is the initial beginnings of the story, and they're asked to complete the story. That is the whole method of story completion. But it began as a way of sort of getting a psychological insight into those people's experiences. So it's very much about that interiority of their own sort of mental thought process and their sort of, neuroses or those other sorts of things that psychoanalytic theory deal with, the Freudian, Jungian stuff that I haven't been trained in, but this is where, it's interesting that this is where the story completion method comes from. And it was very quantitative to begin with as well, so there was lots of counting of what was going on in the content of stories. Now about 20 or odd years ago, Kitzinger and Powell started using the story completion method for qualitative social research. So they basically took that method, turned it around and used it as a way of going beyond the psychological and psychoanalytic dimensions of people's experiences to the shared social norms, tacit assumptions and discourses that are articulated when people finish stories. And that is where the sort of latest story completion crew are really building on that initial work. So it didn't really go very far, so that was 20 years ago. Nobody really used that method very much in the past 20 years, but all of a sudden in the last kind of 2 years or 3 years, it suddenly exploded as a method that social researchers have been interested in exploring. And this has been very much led by people like Victoria Clark and Ginny Brown and their collaborators in the UK. So again, coming out of more a psychological mindset, but a social psychology mindset rather than a therapeutic psychoanalytic mindset. And it's interesting to note that there's a recent issue of qualitative research in psychology, a special issue on story completion method. I don't know who has noticed that. But that has been a real impetus. That only came out very, very recently, earlier this year. And there's about 8 or so articles where different people are working with the method in different sorts of topics. And it's also interesting to note that thus far the story completion method has been used as a way of eliciting people's understandings and responses to very sensitive, personal topics. In some ways kind of socially inappropriate topics, so things like infidelity, body hair in men and women, and norms of body hair removal. There's one recent article that looked at how, in the counselling situation, how people respond to the idea of the counsellor being a fat person. So the idea is that by getting people to complete a story which is about a third person and not about themselves, they might be more likely to kind of reveal sort of currents that might be, if they were to articulate it as their own opinions, might consider to be discriminatory or in other ways stigmatising. So that's the kind of approaches that have been used thus far. So where am I coming from? Well, before I talk about that, I'm just going to say what the story, just so you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the story completion method. So I'm going to talk about the actual story stubs that I used in my project, and then I'm going to go back and talk about the theoretical sort of thinking that's underpinning why I use these story stubs and how I've been analysing those story stubs. So the stub is the initial beginning of the story where you set up the scenario with a hypothetical character and you ask people to complete the rest of the story. It's a pretty simple approach, and I find that most people understand it pretty well and find it quite a fun thing to do, a creative thing to do. So I was interested for this project in setting up 3 story stems that involved people, 3 different people who had a health-related problem that they wanted to find some kind of resolution to. And I deliberately had a mix of sort of a more general health problem and there was a more stigmatised health problem as well. And because I'm really interested in digital health technologies, I was also interested in thinking about how people might use digital health technologies when they're trying to resolve their health problem, or do they seek other forms of help and support, non-digital forms, and how do those, or both, and how those two kind of work together. So here are the story stems that I put together. So I asked the participants, I should say too that I set up a SurveyMonkey online form for people to respond. You just make an open text box, very easy, takes about 5 minutes, and then people just type in their response in the open text box, and there you have it, very easy. And then you use their typed material as your research material. Of course you can do it with pen and paper when you're physically in the same room as people and just get them to write as well. So, first story stem. Isabel wants to improve her health and fitness but doesn't know how to go about this. Okay, so people were asked to say, please complete this story by writing in full sentences. Be as creative as you like. There are no right or wrong ways to complete the story, but please include at least 4 sentences, because I didn't want people to just say a couple of words and be done with it. Okay, so that's the story about Isabel. She wants to improve her health and fitness. I deliberately didn't give any sort of geographical location or age to any of my participants, but obviously from the name Isabel, most people would assume that person is a woman identifying person, female identifying person. But the second one is about someone called Tom, so it's a male identifying person. So Tom has been feeling unusually sad and anxious for a few months. He wonders whether this is normal and what he should do about it. Please complete the story about Tom. And the third one, I deliberately used a gender-neutral name, Alex, and I didn't specify that person's gender. So I said, Alex has been sexually active over the past year and has recently noticed some unusual symptoms that could be signs of a sexually transmissible infection. Alex needs further information to work out what is going on and what to do. So those are my 3 story stems or stubs, depending on what word you use, same thing. So in the kind of ethos of experimentation, how I actually generated participants to complete these 3 stories, I decided, I have a Facebook group called Innovative Social Research Methods, and I also have a lot of followers on Twitter, so I have already a large group of people there. So I set this up as, I said to my followers on Twitter and to the people on the Facebook group, I'm experimenting with the story completion method, would you like to be a participant? Obviously I had ethics approval and they had to sign a consent before they went on to the Survey Monkey. And so it was a way of people who followed me on Twitter or who were on the Facebook group to experiment with being a participant in this method and to learn a bit how it was done that way as well. So that's where the participants came from. So I had 43 people who completed the stories. And socio-demographically, they're the kind of people you might expect who follow me on Twitter or on Facebook. So they're mostly in the 30 to 59 years age group. 39 of them were women, so men, get with the program. There were only 4 men who took the time to complete the stories. They all had university level education. They probably all had PhDs. I didn't actually ask them that specifically, but let's face it, they probably at least a master's degree. So very, very kind of socio-demographically distinct group of people. They were quite geographically dispersed though. So there were 13 from Australia out of the 43. They're about the same from the UK, 12. There were 6 from North America, 5 from continental Europe, 4 from Asia, 2 from Africa. It's interesting, isn't it? And 1 from the New Zealand Pacific region. And 36 identified as white or Caucasian, and 6 as Asian, and 1 as mixed ethnicity. So kind of a little bit of ethnic diversity, but mostly quite homogeneous in other ways. All right, so that is what I did, and it was all meant to be a very experimental thing for me and for them. So just to go back to the theoretical underpinnings. Now, for those of you who know Victoria Clark and Ginny Brown's work, they have a very large following about their thematic content analysis, and they've done very well with, they do a great job of explaining how to do it, and therefore a lot of people are following their thematic content analysis approach. And that does a great job for what they want to do. I take a bit of a different approach. So as I said, I try to, when I do my research projects, when I'm thinking about how to do them, I try to think with theory. At the moment, vital materialism and post-qualitative research methods are my theoretical positions that I'm taking when I'm engaging in research. So the vital materialism theoretical approach comes out of, it's interesting, there's a lot of Indigenous and First Nations cosmologies that incorporate the vital, what we might label as the vital materialism approach. But there's also very interesting work in feminist new materialism that also can be labelled and which I am labelling as vital materialism, so particularly the big four of Braidotti, Barad, Haraway and Jane Bennett. And they're the four feminist new materialists that I tend to work with a lot these days. Then there's some intersections and interesting sort of entanglements with multi-species studies and environmental humanities, which also takes a vital materialist approach. And there's also an interesting subfield on the politics of care. So scholars like Maria Puig de la Bella Casa and Anne-Marie Moll I'm working with there, and also some other feminist STS scholars. So even though they might be labelled across different sorts of interdisciplinary and disciplinary areas, the ones I've just mentioned, they all take a more than human approach to understanding the ways that humans live and move through the world, that humans are already more than human. They're also interested in the more than representation aspects. So how do we understand human experience beyond what we actually can write about, for example? What are the multi-sensory engagements we have with the everyday world and with the other humans and the non-humans with whom we come into contact? And that's, of course, getting back to the Vitalities Lab, which has just gone dead. That's, of course, exactly... Oh, it's even highlighted it there. There we go. That's exactly what I'm trying to do there, as I explained in that first introductory paragraph. So the Brown and Clark approach would be what would be characterised as social constructionist approach. So this more than human materialism approach it goes beyond that, because it's spending more time acknowledging the agency of non-humans in human experience and human embodiment. And also, it's the idea that agencies are distributed with and between the humans and non-humans in the assemblages that come together when we are living our lives. So drawing on this theoretical position, I've been looking at 4 key areas when I do my research, including with the story completion stories. But when I'm doing analysis of interview materials, focus groups, I do some design-based methods where I ask people to generate artefacts using pen and paper, doing mapping, for example, or imagining new technologies, writing those down or drawing them. All those materials, when I'm thinking with this vital materialist perspective, there are 4 key things that I'm sort of sensitising myself to when I'm looking through the materials. And the first one is affordances. Now, in media theory, the word affordance means the way that certain, or in design theory as well for that matter, certain objects, services, media products are designed in certain ways to invite humans to engage with them in certain defined ways. That's the way they've been designed. That's their affordances. Humans may take up those affordances, negotiate them, resist them, ignore them, drop them. So there's lots of complex ways in which humans engage with the affordances of media and objects, other objects. And I would argue that that's where bringing in the affordances of the fleshly human body is really important, as we see how the affordances of things come together with the affordances of people's bodies. So things about our bodies, such as our sensory engagements with the world, our memories, our imagination, our capacities for movement and action. I'm interested in how those affordances of human bodies come together with, or resist with, or kind of clash with the affordances of objects. I'm also interested in affective forces. So that's the notion of affect, sort of building on Deleuzian, Spinozian approaches to affect. The idea of affect as a shared force, and it's distributed between different actors in assemblages. I'm also interested in relational connections, because the vital materialism is very much about how relations between things and people are established and what those connections do. So I'm interested in looking for those connections. So that includes between humans and other humans, but also between humans and non-humans. And I would argue and this is my sort of, part of my analytical schema, that all those things are coming together to create agential capacities. And these agential capacities can open up possibilities for people who are engaging with things, non-humans, or they can actually close, in some cases, close down agential capacities. Right, so that is so when I was reading through the stories, those were the things that I was thinking about when I was seeing how people completed the stories. So, if we get on to the stories. Right, so what I've done is, and this, as I say, this is a work in progress, so I've actually still writing this all and thinking about all of this, so I'll be interested to see what your responses are as well, because that might help me to think through what the implications are. But if we go through, what I've done initially is just to go through with those 4 things that I've talked about: affordances, effective forces, relational connections, and agential capacities, right? So I'm going to go through those because they were the things I was looking for. So if you look at affordances, so the idea of Googling, going online, was an affordance of digital health, right? Doing a Google search is something that people will often tend to do when they've got a health problem and they're worried about it and they're wondering what to do. They Google. Interestingly though, several stories did not mention going online at all. And that's interesting for me because in other research I've done on people's use of digital health, everyone talks about Googling. But it didn't come up so much in these stories. Now, for Alex. Now, Alex is the person with the who's got STI symptoms and is worried about that, or thinks they have STI symptoms. Now, because in Alex's case, it's a very sensitive topic that they might be worried about actually talking to a face-to-face person with, Google search was a really key technology for Alex in terms of the stories that were generated about Alex. So we got this kind of thing. So Alex, and they did tend to give a gender to Alex. They decided to give a gender. So in some cases Alex was a male, in some cases a female. So Alex Googles his symptoms and looks at the possible diagnosis online. He also looks at images to see if they are similar to what he is experiencing. Alex thinks his case might be serious enough to go to his GP and get treatment. So that's a story arc which follows what I've found in my previous research as well. People Google, they sort of self-triage, right, or self-diagnose, and then decide whether they actually need to take the trouble to go and see a healthcare provider. And it's interesting that the power of the image is very important for people too when they're trying to self-diagnose, as in this story. And it's, it can be a really helpful thing if you can see images of symptoms and work out if you've got the same ones. Then there was another story where it actually started, of course she Googles the symptoms first, so this is a different story. You don't want to go to your gynaecologist for no reason. So again, this issue that you really should make sure using online, affordances about whether you actually do have a problem. But then it says the Google search was helpful, but it doesn't have to be something serious, some infection that's annoying but easy to treat. She calls her gynaecologist to make an appointment. So in that case, her anxiety was actually relieved in some way by searching for symptoms online, but she still wants to get that follow-up advice from the GP. Now, when I'm looking at how people use things like Google search and then go onto websites where they find information, in previous research, what's interesting is that even though the medical profession is often really panic-stricken about, Dr. Google and cyberchondria, and if you read medical journal articles about how people Google, it's full of those kinds of accounts of how people, are finding inaccurate information and they're, the worried well are going and, putting a burden on the health system. But on the other hand, we've got this digitally engaged patient discourse, which very much promotes the idea of people being active and finding out their own information before they decide whether to go and seek healthcare, precisely to avoid burden on the healthcare system mostly. And also, some members of the medical profession actually, they want to support the idea of informed patients. That is another dominant discourse. So you get these two competing discourses happening. at least among the medical profession. But what I'm finding in my own research, including the story completion, is that people, yes, they do often Google symptoms, but they use that to then to make an informed choice about whether to seek healthcare. It's not like they avoid healthcare or they kind of panic and go there without really needing to. They actually are seriously considering the processes and the steps. Now, it was interesting that in none of the 3 stories were there mention of apps, for any of the 3 stories, despite the fact that, you know, apps, health apps are often really promoted as a way to get people to, you know, improve their fitness levels, or to, you know, engage in mental health self-care. But no one mentioned those. At least in relation to Alex. So there seemed to be no app that people can imagine that would help someone with an STI. There was no talk of going on Facebook. It's not something you probably want to share with your Facebook friends, the STI issue. And there was talk of only 2 online forums in relation to Alex and the STI. So in one story it was unhelpful. In another story, information provided by other people who had gone through a similar situation was presented as helpful. And what also came out in many of the stories for all the people involved was that the internet provides a lot of information, but it can be really difficult to determine what to do with that information. So that notion that you can be overwhelmed when you Google, and, you know, what do you then do? How do you work out what's the best advice? So for the story about Isabel, who wanted to improve her fitness, somebody says she seeks information. To do this, she Googles ways to improve health and fitness, but finds way too much information. Some of this is contradictory, some confusing, some nonsensical. Now for Isabel's story, they did talk about using a wearable device, a couple of them, and actually that working. So Isabel buys a Fitbit, and it actually helps her to become more active. And I'm actually finding this in other research as well. For many people, that actually can help them. And, you know, a few other stories where she downloads an app to track her daily activity and diet, and it works for her. But in other cases, it didn't work. She downloaded or wasted her money, and it didn't work for her. So there's sort of ambivalent representation. So yeah, it's interesting there. If we look at the affordances of what digital technologies might offer, in most of the stories it was the anonymity offered if you did have a sort of sensitive or highly personal health issue that you wanted to seek advice for. But in other ways, it was actually going out and talking to people, talking to friends, talking to your partner, talking to someone you trusted, a healthcare provider who you've regularly seen. So again, it gets back away from this idea that people necessarily always going online and relying on the experience and expertise and advice they get online, because at least in these stories, people are also seeking advice from their GP, and they're seeking advice from people they know in everyday life. There's also some suggestions, like going back to Isabel again, who wants to improve her health and fitness, that social media accounts like Instagram and YouTube are actually demotivating, because what happens with Isabel is she, I'll just read out this story because it's quite instructive. Isabel goes on Instagram and clicks the fitness tab. God, she utters as she scrolls through the feed filled with exercise videos and snapshots of all the before and afters. A few more swipes later, she puts her phone down and rolls under her duvet. Well, forget that. So this idea that if you follow, you know, the Fitspo Instagram influencers, well, you know, that's so totally unattainable, but it actually is demotivating. And there were some similar stories about going on YouTube and seeing the kind of fitness influencers on YouTube as well. There was also talk about Isabel finding gyms expensive, and also feeling very self-conscious in gyms. So in some cases, finding a friend to exercise with and just do things like walking really worked for Isabel, but she in many cases the gym class thing didn't work for her as well as just having a friend that she could do things with. So that brings me on to relational connections, right? So I've just talked about affordances. So the affordances of social networks, both online and in person, were important in many of the stories. So, to get to the Tom story, he's the one experiencing sadness and not knowing what to do. So he did find some support online for where other people, he could see how other people were dealing with those feelings, but he could do so anonymously, and that was a really important thing for him. So he was making a relational connection with people, but it was very anonymous. They didn't know who he was. He didn't know who they were. In other stories, he does get help from GPs, but where Tom got most help was with a partner, because there was a lot of talk about Tom being a male, finding it very difficult to kind of confront his feelings of sadness and knowing what to do about them. So it was suggested that in many cases his partner would kind of push him along there and take the lead and be the carer for him. So, for example, his symptoms don't improve, so his girlfriend hassles him to see the GP. She makes him an appointment and he gets access for anxiety and depression and starts on a 5-session mental health plan. So, you know, that's basically very much being pushed by his girlfriend in that case. So, there were some cases though where asking other people's advice, other people in your everyday life, was not that helpful. Even GPs. There's talk about competitive friends in Isabel's case, so she doesn't want to sort of do workout classes or walking with her competitive friends because they might show her up. So again, this feelings of feeling very self-conscious and needing to pick the right kind of emotional and social and safe space where you can actually put yourself out there and start exercising. Now, affective forces. Now, they came out really strongly. I think that's the amazing and the really powerful aspect of getting people to use stories, because often the affective forces that are part of people's experiences really come out in stories. So, using the word feeling was really common across the 3 stories. So, these sorts of affects that were described across the 3 stories were feeling concerned, feeling worried, disliking things, disliking sort of, various kind of solutions and not taking them up. Self-consciousness we've talked about. I mean, self-consciousness came out in all 3 stories, whether it's about exposing your body or whether it's about actually letting people know that you're feeling sad because you're a male and that's kind of socially inappropriate, or, being worried about an STI. Feeling judged, anxiety, guilt, shame, lack of motivation or enthusiasm, uncertainty, embarrassment, confusion, doubt, hopelessness, discouragement, vulnerability and fear. So they're kind of negative and disturbing and unsettling affective forces, but there's also feelings of pleasure, happiness, enjoyment, trust, relief, reassurance, hope and accomplishment. So, for example, if we get back to the negative feelings with Tom, what came out really strongly was that normative masculinity and how that really was having a bad effect on Tom and how he could deal with his feelings of sadness. So he had stories such as the following. He had seen his workmates ridicule other blokes at the office who were diagnosed with mental health problems. He is afraid to talk to his friends and family about how he feels. And there's a story here too which was interesting. He's thought about his father and how as he got older he got more withdrawn and silent. Tom doesn't want to end up like that. Everyone hated how his dad was back then. So some really insightful and sensitive kind of understandings there into what it might be like to be a man struggling with these feelings of sadness. Interestingly, Tom was often described as coping with his feelings with using alcohol, or just trying to avoid it and saying, she'll be right, typical Australian expression, I guess. I'll just bury these feelings and life will go on. So there's no actual resolution there. He's still actually got these feelings, but he hasn't sadly achieved any support or help with his feelings. But as I said before, sometimes there's cases where a partner in particular encourages him to seek help. So in another story, it says he talks it over with his partner and they agree to see if they can find him someone he feels okay to talk to about what to do next. So that was the sort of the happy ending often ended up with someone in his life pushing him to find support. Now I'm running out of time, so I will just move on to agential capacities. So when I was looking through the stories, so we've just kind of do a reprise of agential capacities. They are sort of distributed agencies between humans and non-humans that are coming out in the stories, and between humans and humans and humans and non-humans. So when I was looking through the stories, I look for, to begin with, to sort of sensitise myself to those instances, I looked for agential words. And they were words, so like, you know, doing words, right? So verbs, so feels, decides, gets, goes, finds, Googles, talks, makes, sees, looks, helps, starts, thinks, takes, wants, asks, reads, joins, tries, improves, searches, visits, needs and seeks. So I think it's interesting just to start with those kinds of words that are used to talk about how action is taken and what people actually do. In many cases, resolution to the dilemma was a behaviour change taking place once people had found the appropriate sort of affordance, I guess you should say, of the technologies or the groups or the gyms or whatever they used. So in a happy ending, a behaviour change does take place. And people start to feel more motivated and to do something and feel that they can do something about their health problem. In some cases, the problem was resolved by just getting better knowledge about their body and understanding what was going on, and therefore moving from there. And that might involve going online, but also, as I was saying, also talking to other people and seeking healthcare professional advice. In some cases, people tried alternatives, but none has long-lasting beneficial effects. So in some cases, stories ended like that. You know, Isabel tries a fad diet, but it doesn't work, and that's kind of the end. And in some cases, it just all seemed too hard for the people involved as well. So there wasn't an actual, again, a resolution to the story. So that's where things like trying a gym doesn't work because someone feels self-conscious, or trying to go online and finding help doesn't work because you don't find the right online forum to help you. So that's when the agential capacities are closed down. So what I want to do is to end with what I did, another sort of slightly different thing I did when I was going through the stories, and after reading Patricia Levy's book about arts-based research methods, she has a really interesting series of books talking about arts-based research methods, and one of them talks about using poetry. So I thought, given that in the stories a lot of sort of quite poetic, you know, verbal kind of phenomena we use, such as metaphors and so on, I thought I'd go through and distill each person's experience across the stories into a poem for each person. And I found that worked as quite a kind of interesting way to get an insight as to the kind of, particularly the affects that were emerging across the different stories. So I'm just going to finish by reading out the poem, and then there'll be time for some discussion. So Isabel's Story. This is the poem based on Isabel's story. She always feels self-conscious, judged, shy, fat rolls to deal with, doesn't do lycra and protein shakes. Never really fancied the gym, a bit wary about competitive friends. Only the Zumba classes were fun. Yoga sounds more her style. Finds way too much information online. Crazy fad diets, celebrity stories, all the before and afters. Complicated life. It all seems too hard. More trouble than it is worth. If only there was a magic pill for loving fitness. She asks around, decides to speak to her friend. What does health mean to me? Things that matter. Walk, swim, dance, laugh, buy local veggies and cook them. She keeps walking absolutely everywhere, makes some new friends, chooses contentment. So these are what's called found poems. These are actual words taken across the different stories that I've put together in a poem form. Tom's story. Just to remind, Tom's the one with the feelings of sadness. Afraid to talk to his friends and family, doesn't want to see any of his friends, scared of ridicule, feeling quite alone, doesn't want to see a psychologist. He's not crazy, just having a hard time. Doesn't feel like this is going to go away anytime soon. Often wakes up in the night, has not been sleeping well, more withdrawn and silent. He's really struggling, drinks a lot. He doesn't know how to talk about his feelings, doesn't really know how to put it into words. Always tired. The feelings cover him like a blanket. The pain is not leaving. What is this sadness anyway? Maybe this just passes eventually. Maybe he just needs a holiday. Googles, goes online, searches sad and anxious, feels a bit overwhelmed, reads all the sad blog posts, realises that he's not alone in feeling like this. Talking to his partner helps. Regular exercise offers some relief. Swimming in the Pacific Ocean is a tonic. Starting to feel a bit better again. Alex's story, one with the STI, possible. Maybe it was that woman from the bar. He's going to ask questions. Failing to stay calm. Guilt, shame, a bit nervous, embarrassed. It all feels a bit grubby. Can't sleep well at night. The internet both reassures and terrifies. Maybe this just goes away on its own, but it could be serious. Between a rock and a hard place. Doesn't want to talk to anyone about it, feeling vulnerable. Surely it can't be all that bad. I need help. Better get it cleared up. So I don't know about you, but I think those poems kind of encapsulate a lot of feelings and really richly kind of report how people responded to those story stems. And what I like about them is the poems in themselves trace a bit of a trajectory in poetic form. They themselves are a form of narrative that I obviously have co-generated with the respondents in my study. So, and I also kind of like that it actually ends with on an upbeat as well. In each of them I tried to make it end on a bit of an upbeat feeling. So I will leave it there. I'm interested in your comments and questions. Thank you.
Anybody like to start?
Thanks very much. I'm working with some other data narratives written by narrative writers from testimonies to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Childhood Sexual Abuse. And it's very interesting to work with these narratives when I'm very used to working with interview data from individuals telling their own stories. And so I was thinking about the stories that people have written from your stems. Do they track a particular trajectory, like trying to provide a story that is neat and resolved and not internally contradictory, which is what you get when you speak with people about their own experiences?
Yeah. Well, actually both, Carla. So in some cases there were a neat resolution, but in other cases it's left hanging a bit. So it's interesting there were both, because of course with a story, the traditional format of the narrative, a fictional narrative, of course, is that it does tend to be a resolution. You know, there's a story arc and there's a resolution, people did conform to that quite a lot, but not always, which is interesting. So I guess that's maybe the people who involved in this story completion study were acknowledging that not every story has a neat or happy ending, and that's interesting that they acknowledge that, particularly when you're dealing with a complex issue like, for example, a man feeling sad and anxious, where there seems to be often, or a man or a woman for that matter, but in our society, a man, it's even more problematic in many cases because he has struggles with normative masculinity and around expressing those feelings and finding help. That in many cases there wasn't really a happy ending. He just kind of kept struggling, which does reflect, I guess, the reality of many men living that life. And with the woman who wanted to get fitter and healthier, The stories acknowledge that in some cases, yes, she finds an activity that she enjoys and the end, happy ever after, but others acknowledge that it's hard to change your behaviour and continue to do your exercise routine or whatever. And with the STI, that actually probably had the most sort of story out, because even though it's a sensitive and often embarrassing situation, once you find the right kind of help, it can be pretty easily resolved for most people. So yeah, it's interesting. It depended on the story and the problem.
Hi Deborah, thanks. I'm just curious, so you were sort of talking about the vital materialisms as a different way of analysing the data generated from the story completion, as opposed to how Brown and Clark and some of the other story completion people would do it. Do you see the data that's generated as being in quite a different way as well? Because I guess you have that turn from it being about the sort of internal Rorschach kind of inkblot type psychoanalysis trajectory to the, these are just the kind of social constructions that people live amongst and are kind of reciting in the story. Do you see that differently? Because obviously you're analysing it differently, but the actual data being generated, how do you view that?
Yeah, good question. So in some ways, it's not an anti-social constructionist approach that I'm taking, because it's acknowledging that we generate our lived experiences and the sense making about our lived experiences drawing on discourse, and that's what Brown and Clark and colleagues tend to, they do discourse analysis, right? That is important to do, to understand that yes, there are the shared discourses that we tend to draw on, but also, I guess, getting back to Carla's question, there's shared story arcs, right, isn't there? There's shared kind of expectations about what a story is, how a story should resolve itself, whether there should be a happy ending or not, or any kind of ending rather than leaving things hanging. So they're also drawing on conventions of stories as well as discourse, and I'm sure Brown and Clark and colleagues recognise that they would do. But I guess I'm moving on from the more sort of discourse analysis, is that notion of the more than human, what it tells us about the more than human engagements that people have. So I guess I'm focusing on the complexities of the interactions that people have with things like Google search engine or apps or gyms. It doesn't have to be digital. Gyms came up a lot. That's a kind of technology, right? That's an affordance of a thing. Or GPs for that matter, healthcare providers. So that would be the main difference I would see, and also acknowledging that agency is generated with and through those different entanglements that are constantly dynamic as well. And that's not to say, what I'm saying is that's what I'm really sensitised to and focusing on, and at the moment the other people who've used story completion haven't really, just because that's not their thing, that's not where they're coming at it from. So
focused on gender as a really big variable.
Yeah, they like to often do a comparison with looking at how people talk about different genders, and in some ways that did come up as well, right, in my findings. So you're getting very much the gendered Isabel feeling incredibly self-conscious about her fat rolls, and wearing lycra and feeling self-conscious at the gym. And then you're getting the story of Tom and his struggles with his feeling vulnerable around, being a man in our society. So gender did come out there, yeah, which is interesting.
Hi, I just had a question about the extent to which humour came up in the stories, just sort of thinking about humour as a strategy when dealing with sensitive issues, and whether or not that was present in any of the stories.
It came up with Isabel more than the others, so I think I read one out which was quite funny, where she rolls out and just puts the duvet over her head and says it's all too much trouble. With the other two, not so much, mainly because maybe she just wanted to get healthier, but one person's dealing with feelings of sadness quite a serious, I guess people dealt with that quite sensitively and seriously. They didn't really want to make jokes about it, interestingly, or make light of it. And the same with the kind of STIs in some ways. There weren't actually jokes much about that. It was more about, you know, a lot of talk about that person, Alex, being terrified or, you know, Googling and frightening themselves even more. I guess that was a little bit lighthearted, some of those, but yeah, humour wasn't used that much. Yeah.
Time for one more question, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Deborah. I was lucky to go to Ginny's story completion. So I work with young people, and we've used body mapping. And I'm interested about the people who don't have good literacy. Is there ways of doing story completion with audio or even some cartoon drawing? I don't know the literature as well as you would, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, Sally, that raised it interesting. So who was I talking to yesterday? I've had so many meetings the last few days. Oh, my God. But anyway, I know. Was it someone in the room who was talking to me about working with people with disabilities who had speech difficulties and using photographs or other images. So, and you can do that with pre-verbal children, right, even preschoolers or those struggling with literacy, using images. And I've been talking to I've been showing people these cards that I just got from a colleague in the Imaginaries Lab in the Carnegie Mellon University, and they've got images of things, and it's used to inspire new metaphors, new metaphorical thinking, and you show them these images, people that you're working with, and again, it's an image. And it's a way of thinking about new ways of thinking. So you take something that's a completely different image to the way you might think about something. So with like big data, we think of big data as being, you know, the new oil, or waves are big data, tsunamis are big data. But if you ask people to choose a new image, like one that I was looking at today is a cracks in the footpath. That's one of the photo images. And say, okay, if we think about big data in this way, what does that mean for you? So yeah, there's lots of really interesting ways that you can get this kind of generative thinking happening using images. Absolutely. Yeah.
We're right on time. I don't know if there are some more questions, but we have the room a little bit longer if you'd like to stick around and chat with Deborah. But please join me in thanking Deborah for a really thoughtful.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.